Welcome to the KUBIK Report podcast. We're glad you joined us today. I am pleased to share my 17th podcast with Greg Thomas. I'm happy once again to have him joining us on the KUBIK Report. I might add that I'm adding a playlist of Greg's podcasts in one playlist, so you can go to it and see all 17 all at once and choose the one you want to do. So I'll be adding that, and you'll see the link to it in the show notes. Greg is a business leader, author, keynote speaker, and a personal life coach that I've known for nearly 2 decades. His clients range from large Fortune 100 corporations down to small family-oriented businesses, and many individual clients seeking personal leadership development. His website is LeadershipExcellence.now.com. As a reminder, you can learn more about Greg's trading skills on his YouTube site. Simply type in Leadership Excellence Channel on the YouTube homepage search bar, and you will find him. So, Greg, welcome back to the KUBIK Report.
Well, thank you, Vic. Good morning, and I'm glad to be with you today from rainy but warm Litchfield, Ohio, where I reside. I'm here in my own home office this morning, and nice and cozy, and it's always great to have and share a podcast with you.
Well, today on this last day of March here, it's still cold and cool here in Indianapolis, where I'm located. We can't wait for warmer weather. In the past, we have spoken with Greg about a lot of interesting topics, including personal leadership development, business leadership, servant leadership, how to have a fulfilling and productive day, and common misconceptions about the law of attraction, effective communication, and avoiding conversational terrorism. You can find all these past episodes on the KUBIK Report. I might add, you can also check the playlist that we have that includes all the podcasts all in one list. Recently, Greg and I posted a podcast on the topic of emotional intelligence, and it's generated a lot of positive comments. I've had people call me and say, this is what I needed to hear. It really made my day. We played this podcast on a trip with my granddaughter and my wife, and we said, what can we listen to as we're driving? And so we played the podcast, and both my wife and my granddaughter said, wow, that was very, very good, very helpful information. So we've decided to continue our discussion on today's podcast.
All right. Well, thank you, Vic. I think that it might be best for me to recap what we covered last time, because I know most of your listeners are like me. They often jump into part 2 of something because it grabs their interest and didn't listen to part 1. So we don't want to leave anyone behind. So I'll go ahead and just recap a little bit some of the highlights that we talked about last time.
That would be good, because after I listened to the podcast, I said, hey, I got to write these points down because I need to kind of remind us both where we're going. And Greg already had that as a point. So
All right.
Tell us what we talked about last time, please.
Well, emotional intelligence, which is called EI, also sometimes called emotional quotient or EQ, has 2 components. The first one is the ability to master our own emotions. And when you possess high EQ, you have the ability to understand your emotions, to use your emotions effectively, manage them, to handle your own emotions. So that's the first part of emotional intelligence. The second part is equally as important. That's the ability to perceive other people's emotions, read other people's emotions. So you become aware of their emotions. You make the effort to understand their genuine concerns rather than just discarding them or correcting people immediately or telling them they shouldn't feel that way. You make a real effort to understand where they're coming from and their genuine concerns, and try to listen with empathy, to put yourself in their shoes so you know where they're coming from. And this includes the ability to de-escalate tension when you can, because sometimes conversations are filled with tension. That's part of being human. That's part of where some of our conversations go. And someone with high emotional intelligence works very hard to de-escalate tension when it gets to a point where it could become destructive.
Hmm.
Emotional intelligence is built around three major models, but you know what? I'm not even going to talk about those because that's getting into the weeds. And the three models aren't of that much interest to me, so I'm certainly not going to put our listeners to sleep by going through those. So let me give you a quick history, Vic, if I
Sure.
can, of how EQ was discovered. It started with the whole concept of emotional strength, and that was introduced by Abraham Maslow, someone that many of us have heard of. He was an American psychologist in the 1950s. He was the author of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which many people are familiar with. And he came up with that term emotional strength to separate it from just mental acuity. And this concept, emotional strength, was added to and expanded by a lot of different researchers in the 60s, going into the 90s. But it became widely known with the publication of a book by Daniel Goleman, and the book was Emotional Intelligence: Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. For years, people had wondered, why don't just really smart people make great leaders? After all, they're smart. You would think having a high IQ would inspire you to be a good decision maker, would help you to logically figure out complex problems, would give you all of these benefits for great leadership. But that's not what history tells us. History also shows us a lot of people who were just average, who had incredible leadership skills and achieved wonderful things. So there was always a missing element in just looking at IQ. And that's where the discovery of EQ came along and helped to put the puzzle pieces together and helped everyone to understand that there's an additional, very important part of our minds that relate to leadership and relate to our ability to be mature human beings
Hmm.
and have productive relationships. So beyond that, numerous studies have occurred over the past 20 plus years by various psychologists and researchers, and many of them, most of them, have concluded that a higher EI is associated with higher leadership
Hmm.
effectiveness and the higher achievement of organizational goals. Another thing they discovered, which, as I mentioned last time, is a little humbling to us men, but there are gender differences in EI that have been observed, and women tending to score higher levels of EI than men simply because they have more empathy. They are more sensitive to other people's emotions. They read other people's emotions quite well. Other studies have found that EI correlates positively with performance in teams, strong positive personal relationships, one-on-one, relationships with coworkers, and stress management capabilities. So EI is tied into all of those things, and they're all very, very important to not just organizational leadership, but personal leadership. You remember going back a number of our podcasts together, we wanted to emphasize the importance of personal leadership.
Hmm.
And to define that succinctly, that is when we choose to take direction over our lives. We choose not to allow time and chance to make all our important life decisions for us, because time and chance doesn't care about your goals, doesn't care about your dreams. Time and chance is arbitrary, and we don't want time and chance just guiding our lives. So therefore, we can choose who and what we need to become in this life through effort, through self discipline, through personal growth, through expanding our minds and knowledge and understanding, through humility, a lot of tools that we can do to develop personal leadership. And one of those critical tools is developing a high EI and learning to master our emotions and read the emotions of others better. Here's some really good news.
Hmm.
Research suggests that emotional intelligence can be developed and strengthened. And that is contrast to just IQ, which remains relatively stable once we become an adult. So we can actually become better and more mature and have a greater developed degree of emotional intelligence. And that becomes a critical factor, both in our personal lives, how we relate to our spouses, how we relate to our friends, how we relate to our family members, how we relate to our church family, and also, of course, a critical factor in our personal success, whether you work for someone else or whether you're a business owner. Emotional intelligence plays a key in all of those things.
Listening to the podcast with others, people were saying, well, we'd like to hear some very practical applications of it. We know in principle that it's something that's needed, but we would like to be able to have something practical. One person who wrote in and
Mm-hmm.
commented about the podcast, he said that where he worked at his company, that a particular book was required for employees to read about emotional intelligence. So it was already understood that this subject is very, very important. Last time we talked a lot about emotional intelligence, how it's essential for a leader working with groups or teams. But Greg, how does emotional intelligence influence personal one-on-one relationships?
That's something we need to talk about because we did emphasize working with groups and teams in part one. And obviously, a large part of our relationships are one on one, again, with our spouses, with our children, with our friends, with our family members beyond our, immediate family, our extended family. A lot of what we do are one-on-one relationships. And here too is where high emotional intelligence can pay off and help us to improve those relationships. First of all, we learn to better express ourselves. People with high emotional intelligence can articulate their feelings and their needs more effectively. You're able to tell people how you feel and why you feel the way that you do. So you're no longer hiding behind a shield. You no longer have this mask because you have mastery over your own emotions. Makes you more open and allows you to be vulnerable because you know how much you can share, you know what you should share, what's in your heart and going on in your life, and you can articulate that far better when you have high emotional intelligence. Another thing that it helps us with, and we've talked about this before in previous podcasts, is active listening, the ability to
Mm-hmm.
suspend our own thinking and judgment and to truly listen to what others are saying, to be attentive to both their verbal and their nonverbal cues, because sometimes nonverbal cues tell us what's really going on inside someone, if they're sad or if they're struggling with something, more so than the words that are coming out of their mouths. So it gives you the ability to be more attentive to those cues, and it leads to deeper understanding as you can seek to relate to that person more deeply. It helps in conflict resolution. It helps in addressing disagreements constructively rather than flying off the handle, rather than saying something that's going to be offensive or hurtful to someone. We are able to control our emotions, which means we say things more tactfully,
Mm-hmm.
which means there are some things that enter our head that should never come out of our mouths. Again, that's part of becoming an adult and growing up and learning to have the ability to filter. As I said last time, that we've got that big filter in our heads called the brain, and it
Mm-hmm.
was designed to filter out the thoughts that come into it so that they don't come out of our mouths. The conflict resolution of emotional intelligence also helps us to focus on solutions
Mm-hmm.
rather than focusing on blame. As human beings, we tend to want to know who's wrong,
Mm-hmm.
where the focus should always be on
What?
what is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
not who is wrong. You can always tactfully address someone who's struggling or made a mistake, but that shouldn't be the major focus. If you're going to be a problem solver, the problem isn't with people. The problem are with the decisions and processes that
Mm-hmm.
come from people, not from people themselves. So it helps us a lot with conflict resolution, all under the branch that we would just call general communication.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's a maturity that I feel is very important in interpersonal relationships, especially as you climb in a business and develop a team, to have the emotions, your emotional maturity to the point of where you do see how things should work rather than who's who. That is very immature to base your decision upon
Mhm.
even who leads or who has this based upon your friendship with somebody or your liking somebody, but more focused on what what they do, what the fruits are, what the results are. And I think that's a very, very important point that you brought out.
And that leads to another aspect of how it influences our personal relationships, and that is we approach people with empathy and a desire for understanding. Perspective taking helps us to be better at seeing situations from someone else's point of view. When we are determined to look at things from their perspective, that doesn't mean we have to agree with them. It certainly doesn't mean that they're right. But when we try to look at things from their point of view, we better understand them and better understand where they're coming from. And that oftentimes will lead us to providing a greater emotional support. When you have high emotional intelligence, you can offer more meaningful support during difficult times. Sometimes people just need to be encouraged. A good thank you is important to be able to share with people on a routine basis. Knowing when it's time to inspire, motivate, encourage, sensing those situations because you're reading the emotions of others, knowing this person just needs a real good talk about encouragement, about how important they are, about how valuable they are, about what a great contributor they are, what an impact they've had in my life. And all of that is part of providing and sensing emotional support that comes from growing in emotional intelligence.
Oh, and a converse might be if somebody gaffes and says something very, very untoward a person. That could be something that that person lives with for the rest of their life.
Mm-hmm.
A comment. I might just mention one is that I was in fifth grade, I believe, or so, and I was one who sometimes talked too much in class. When somebody would be answering a question, I'd kind of help them along or whatever.
Yeah,
I'd be saying things, and the teacher just snapped at me and said, "That's how they do things in Czechoslovakia. That's not the way we do things here." And I thought, well, she kind of knew my background as being Ukrainian. She even got the country wrong. But I mean, I still remember that to this very day.
sure.
That happened, almost 70 years ago, and I live with that. Not that I dwell on it or anything, but I remember those types of
Yeah,
strong
definitely.
statements. And like you said, saying encouraging things is what helps a person's health
Hmm.
along the way in maturing.
Yeah, that's a great example, Vic. And it also ties in with validation. So when you have high emotional intelligence, it enables you to acknowledge and validate other people's feelings. Again, that doesn't mean you have to agree with their feelings. That doesn't mean that you think they're necessarily right, but you acknowledge and you validate their feelings. Yes, I understand how you feel, and I understand and why you feel that way. So you're validating their feelings. You're not simply dismissing them. You're not looking for an opportunity to correct them and tell them how wrong they are. What you're seeking, if you want to have really a great relationship regarding communication, is you're fostering a sense of being understood. I understand you. And
Mm.
sometimes that means just allowing them to vent a little bit, allowing them to get off their chest with something that's bothering them and allow them to talk. I mean, when you become a certified counselor and coach like I am, one of the things that you're taught is learn to be just an incredible listener.
Hmm.
Some people think they have to have all the answers and they're constantly interjecting their opinion or telling people. And but when you're really a great counselor, when you're really a great personal life coach or business coach, you're doing an incredible amount of listening. And only after someone has talked and talked and talked and shared with you their situation, their frustrations, their challenges, what's on their mind, maybe follow up by a few questions you simply ask to gain more information. Only after all of that is done do you make the effort to share with them what you think
Hmm.
is important in the discussion and maybe how you can help them and encourage them and maybe provide them some guidance and answers on what they're struggling with. So that sense of validation, what that listening is saying, I want to understand you.
Hmm.
And that's a very important concept and related to high emotional intelligence. And also tied to that is emotional regulation, learning to regulate our emotions because we're all human. We lose our cool sometimes. I lose my cool sometimes. Some great leaders in history struggled with patience. George Washington, for example, he could be triggered, and it was like a volcano going off. When he went off, everyone who was in the room wanted to leave the room because the president, he normally was a very even-keeled man, but his buttons could be pushed. And, he was struggling with a lot of issues and problems trying to win a revolutionary war and struggling with a Congress that wasn't providing him the things that he really needed to fight well. And sometimes he would lose his cool. But primarily, he was a very even keeled, even tempered individual. So emotional regulation is very important. And it relates to stress management, where we learn better handling of stress to prevent us from negatively impacting relationships. Obviously, when we're under stress, we have a shorter trigger point.
Hmm.
So if we're not managing our stress, if we're not making efforts to reduce stress and using stress management to our benefit, and that could be through meditation, it can be through exercise, it can be through having a conversation with a close friend where we know we can be confidential. A lot of things can help us with stress management. And that's important because it helps us from not having negative relationships because we just go off on someone because we're triggered. Anger management is another one, control over negative emotions. Harmful outbursts are very hurtful. And you relate something that happened to you in school, and we've all gone through situations where just it seemed like out of nowhere, we're in a conversation, we triggered someone, and they say something extremely hurtful,
Hmm.
and you remember that for the rest of your life. It stings.
Hmm.
And again, with high emotional intelligence, we learn to control our emotions and to cut ourselves off before we say loud or obnoxious comments or outbursts to people that are going to cause lasting
Hmm.
harm. Positive atmosphere. That's the ability to maintain a positive mood. I mentioned how most times President Washington was just very even keel. He was a professional, he was a gentleman. Everyone who worked with him loved him. Loved him to the degree they would take a bullet for him because that's how admired that he was. And that's because he usually maintained a positive mood. And that creates a healthier relationship environment. When you'll take an example of us and our spouses or us and our children. When we're all in positive moods, you don't find many areas for conflict.
Hmm.
We're more accommodating to one another, we're more open minded to our differences, and it creates that positive atmosphere in which healthy communication can take place. So, all of those are under the auspices of emotional regulation.
Now, one thing too, I would say that after listening to the first podcast with others,
Hmm.
the question was, "Wow, this is tremendous knowledge. This is just getting started." And you also mentioned that EQ or EI can be improved, while IQ is something that we're kind of stuck with. With our
Hmm.
IQ is what it is, and yes, it could be improved with some reading and studying, and emotional intelligence can be improved. And as one person said, "Hey, I would like to really improve mine. What are some of the things that could be done? How can we do it, Greg?"
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. It can be improved, but it's improved through conscious effort and practice. It cannot be improved just by taking an herb or a vitamin, or it has to come through discipline. And again, that just ties in with that personal leadership that we talked about earlier. It's a choice. We choose to be conscious about how we communicate, conscious about what we say. We reevaluate what we say in difficult situations, and we learn and we practice and become better and better at developing high emotional intelligence. And the key to this is to remember that it's a gradual process and it's going to require consistent effort and self reflection. There are no magic bullets, there's no instantaneous way overnight to develop high emotional intelligence. It comes through a lot of self effort, a lot of hard work. a number of things that we can do that are all tied into our self-awareness. One is to practice mindfulness, and mindfulness is an important concept. Religious people meditate on spiritual principles all the time, and that's really good. Meditation takes us out of the present frustrations and challenges in this world and helps us to think about something positive, something beneficial, something desirable. And this, of course, ties in with our positive self talk, and we've talked about that in the past as well. But practicing that meditation is we become better aware of ourselves and we ask ourselves some genuine, serious questions. Why did I react that way yesterday in that conversation?
Hmm.
How could I have said that differently in that conversation that I had yesterday with my wife or with my coworker? We develop a greater sense of self-awareness when we practice that mindful meditation. Another thing we can do is repeat daily affirmations. If we
Hmm.
sense that we're struggling in an area, affirmations are extremely biblical. For example, when Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, that's a positive affirmation
Right.
that Paul shared. He gave credit where it was due, he gave credit to Jesus Christ, but I can do that because Christ is dwelling inside of me. That's an example of a positive daily affirmation. We can write our own. So we say to ourselves, I am a patient, active listener. If we sense we're being rude, if we sense we're not letting people finish their sentences, it's a good example of a daily affirmation that we can write down on a post-it note and that we can repeat to ourselves a number of times a day. And what we're doing is we're rewiring our thinking by saying those positive affirmations. We happen to cover that in a previous podcast, so that's certainly available for anyone who wants to hear that on the KUBIK Report.
Hmm.
Another important thing we can do regarding self awareness is seek feedback from others.
Hmm.
The scriptures talk about a multitude of counselors. And I might add that those multitude of counselors are supposed to be people who can be very open and frank with us and oftentimes tell us things we don't want to hear. The last thing I need is a group of counselors are a room full of bobbleheads, all sitting
Hmm.
there nodding, agreeing with everything I think and say and do. That's not helping me at all. A multitude of counselors means individuals who can come up with you and tactfully and honestly say, I understand where you're coming from. I heard your presentation. I saw you respond to this situation in this way, and it could be better because, and they give you the information to help you grow that you need and to openly seek feedback from others to say to a friend or a spouse or someone, how could I have handled that better? If you sense you didn't do something extremely well, to ask some people who were a witness to that event, what do you think I could have done better? How could I have said that better? Another thing we can do to have greater self awareness is to take personality and EI assessments. I'm going to mention two that are very good and they're free. I like to say free is good. And one of them is from an organization, Management Training Specialist. And if you go to mtdtraining.com, that's mtdtraining.com, you will see that there's a free EQ test available. Another one I'm going to recommend that comes highly recommended from me and others is the Institute for Health and Human Potential. You should probably be aware of that institute anyway, also called the IHHP. Their website is ihhp.com. Again, that's ihhp.com, and they also have a free emotional intelligence quiz that you can take, and it will help you to understand where you're at now and offer some suggestions to have a greater degree of self awareness. Another thing that ties into this is self regulation, learning to control ourselves. And that includes better stress management. And stress management can include a deep breathing, which helps to break anxiety within our tension, within our body. There's progressive muscle relaxation. Again, I won't get into the weeds, but that's a technique that's very powerful where you learn to tense and relax different muscle groups, and that's helpful in reducing stress management. I do a lot of walking. Exercise is important. I also, when the weather is permitting, I do a lot of outdoor work with gardening because I find that working with my hands, digging into the soil, having a good exercise routine, taking a long walk are very beneficial in reducing stress because it gets your mind off of stressful things and it helps your body to relax and helps reduce anxiety. Also, I mentioned this last time, Vic, is the pause and respond technique. Many of us, because of our Western culture, have been trained to say virtually anything impulsively that comes into our heads. And with the pause and respond technique, you teach yourself to pause 3 or 4 seconds before you respond when there's something that you urgently want to say. And you'll be amazed at how that slight response and pause before it is more balanced because you hesitated to say the first thing that came into your mind. There's a similar business technique that I teach people in coaching, and that is when you're extremely aggravated, when you're just really angry, when you're just furious, you can't take it anymore. Always wait 24 hours before getting anything off your mind.
Hmm.
Because the difference in the way that you will approach it then, which is going to be triggered, and the way that you'll approach it in 24 hours will be far more mature, a little more measured, far more balanced, just through that process of time where you cooled off, your emotions got closer to normal, and you're going to respond in a far healthier way than impulsively. So, those are just important things to think about.
I feel that there are times when you can't do it yourself. You need to have a little bit of outside help to help with certain dysfunctions
Mm-hmm.
emotionally. And I specifically speak about anger, and perhaps we ought to do an entire podcast on the subject of anger management, because as you said, you
Sure.
go fly off the handle and you cannot control yourself. And in working with ministry, which I have within the organization, there were times when we had to talk to a minister about anger that welled up beyond normal
Mm-hmm.
limits. And we had to send him to some treatment, if you put it that way, or counseling for that. Sometimes very, very intensive, because anger would come out in sermons, anger would come out in dealing with people. And while he was a very intelligent person, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because a person gets angry because you talk to them about their anger. But
Yeah.
but in this one particular case, I was so pleased is that he realized that he had a problem with it, that he flew off the handle.
Mm-hmm.
His wife did too. And he felt like it was just beyond his control. And we sent him to a place that helped him with this in a structured way. And we found that it really made a lot of difference to him. It really changed him from the way he was, because he learned techniques, he learned habits, and he really was able to bring that under control. Now, it turned out that we had to transfer his job to being away from working directly with people to more
Mm-hmm.
a writer and researcher, which he was very good at. He was a brilliant person. But the
Sure.
important thing is that our relationship did not change. Our relationship was healthy. He wasn't angry at me, for
Mm-hmm.
putting him
Mm-hmm.
through this ordeal. Is that at
Right.
conferences, at future times in the past, we could walk up to each other and talk. We found that we could even have dinner together, and that we could act normally as Christians or people of any other structure of behaviors conduct themselves. So I wanted to add that comment.
I'm glad you did, Vic, and I want to emphasize to everyone, please be humble enough. If you're really struggling with something seriously and you've been struggling with it for a lifetime, please be humble enough to get help. It's like draw an analogy with our physical health. If your loved ones, if people are telling you you don't look well, that you look extremely pale, or you're just not looking good, be humble enough to go to the doctor and to have a physical and find out if you're okay. We have this unique ability to deceive ourselves. Oh, I'm feeling fine, right? To deceive ourselves. And sometimes we just need to be humble enough to listen to others and get the help that we need. And the same is true emotionally. If we're struggling with anger, if we're long term struggling with depression or constant discouragement, there is help available. And I'm not necessarily talking about going on powerful drugs. Those aren't the answer. They may be for some, but those aren't the first course of action that a good doctor is going to give you. It's going to provide some therapy and help you to learn to manage those thoughts and feelings and help you in every way that they can. And that's part of being a humble human being. We're all flawed creatures. We all struggle with different things in our lives, and being humble enough to seek help in those areas where we need it. And of course, this ties in with this discussion we've been having on self-regulation, and that is to develop those healthy coping mechanisms. And sometimes it is to seek professional support. It may be learning early on to write down our thoughts and feelings. Some people use a process called journaling. Now, it's never
Hmm.
done a whole lot for me. Of course, I'm left-handed. I can't even read what I just wrote in the journal 5 minutes later because my handwriting is so terrible. But some people find journaling to be very, very helpful because it's just a way for you to vent and express those emotions on a piece of paper. And then you can read it and ask yourself, why do I feel this way? What in my life has caused me to have these feelings and to react in this way? So it can be great for you to have a higher degree of self-awareness of what's going on in your head. You can also engage in physical hobbies. That's a great coping mechanism for emotions. Again, get out and dig in the earth, get back to nature. Get back and do some things that you enjoy, a hobby that you truly enjoy to get your mind off of yourself, a release for some of those emotions that we're struggling with.
Hmm.
And then the final area that I'll discuss today ties in with empathy. How can we develop a greater sense of empathy? And
Hmm.
this is something that we males often struggle with because we come from a Western culture and we males are told not to show our emotion. We all grew up watching John Wayne movies, right? And we want this outside, we want to be hard, and we don't want to show that we're hurt, and so we're emotionless. And the things that we struggle with as males in our Western culture. One thing we can do to develop a greater degree of empathy is, of course, active listening. And that again is a choice. That again is hard, but learning to focus on understanding other people's perspectives. When we understand their perspectives and, for example, why they live in poverty, maybe we'll be less judgmental.
Hmm.
Why they had a poor education, maybe we'll be less judgmental and harsh in them. Why they're struggling, what part of their background makes them struggle with the ability to communicate or socialize with others. When you learn those things and you make the time and effort to learn those things about other people, you will develop a greater degree of empathy. Another thing you can do is to learn to read fiction and nonfiction stories. And when you do that, you learn to explore diverse emotional experiences.
Hmm.
Some of those experiences, as you read in a really good book, will make you sad, will make you feel sorry for that person, will make you root for that person, will engage you and your emotions in ways that you normally would not. So, reading good fiction and nonfiction stories about the struggles of others, how some overcame adversities, maybe handicaps to achieve great and wonderful things, and you find out all that they went through and all of the things that they struggled with, teaches us to explore diverse emotional experiences. Another thing we can do is volunteer or engage in community service to help the unfortunate in our society. You'll have much greater empathy if you serve at a food kitchen or you're doing something that helps those who, unfortunately, in their lives have come out at a difficult place. And maybe they are living in extreme poverty. Maybe they are struggling with 10 generations of a lack of value of education, and because of that, they struggle to make good decisions and they struggle to make positive life choices. And by learning to associate with them, to listen to them, to serve them, it will develop within you a greater empathy for where they're coming from and where they're at. And it'll help you to be less judgmental. And you'll see sometimes that there aren't quick answers to many of these nuances that human beings struggle with. You can't overcome 10 generations of dysfunction by one paragraph sentence to
Mhm.
someone. It takes time, it takes love, it takes effort to help them to get out of whatever they're struggling with and move forward. And you learn that when you're engaging with them, when you're helping them.
Well, Greg, at one family weekend, you were the featured speaker, and you gave a talk about how if your generation and the things that you do are right, are passed down to another generation, and that you did a study of past generations of
Hmm.
how if one family is successful in education, doctors, particular
Yeah,
professions, they
absolutely.
pass that down to others. While you go back and you find those who were thieves and robbers and murderers and all that, you have a generation after generation of criminal behavior. And you talked about the importance of setting these things in your life, not just for yourself, but for your future, for the people that come from you. So that's a very, very true statement. It is an unselfish statement and a statement not only for your family, but for the human race.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and if I recall correctly in that message, I may have mentioned my own experiences. So my biological father, who was a gifted and talented man, I mean, he had patents. He was a tool and die maker. He had patents through the government. He co-founded a business, just very smart man.
Mm-hmm.
And he became an alcoholic and he trashed his life and his family and his relationships. And growing up, I just realized and determined that I was going to draw a line in the sand, that the dysfunction stops right here
Mm-hmm.
and it stops now with me,
Mm-hmm.
and that I was not going to continue that kind of dysfunction in my generation and influence negatively my children and grandchildren. And I made that determination. Again, that's part of personal leadership. And I didn't necessarily have to go cold turkey. I mean, I enjoy a glass of wine as much as the next person, but I know my limits.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that, a couple of glasses of wine is my limit and that's it. So I didn't have to become a teetotaler
Mm-hmm.
to make that commitment either. I just had to determine that I can choose. And no matter how much dysfunction went before me in previous generations, it's my responsibility to draw a line in the sand and say it stops here
Mm-hmm.
and it stops now with me. And every one of us can make that determination no matter what we're struggling with in our personal lives.
Well, listen, Greg, this has been wonderful talking to you today. I've really appreciated this. Usually you end on just saying a few words of summary.
Yeah, I'd be happy. We all have the ability to grow and change ourselves. I encourage everyone to cultivate a growth mindset. No matter what you're struggling with, say to yourself, I can overcome this. That happens to be a positive affirmation, but say to yourself, I can overcome this. And a combination of what you can do and getting support from others. If you're a spiritual person, going to the source of the universe for help in your own family, setting an example, asking your spouse to help you to overcome whatever you're struggling with. If it's really serious, being humble enough to get the help that you need, but realize that you can change and grow. You can cultivate a growth mindset with determination and help, that you can overcome anything that's going on in your life. And you can also develop a higher degree of emotional intelligence.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. Are we going to have number 3?
Sure,
Okay.
we probably have enough information for one final episode of emotional intelligence, and then we can move on to maybe anger management or something else that's on our minds.
I would just love to have number 3 and anger management in particular down the road, plus other topics that come up. And if you have any questions or would like any particular topic, please let us know. So thank you, Greg. Have a
Okay,
great week, and it's been enjoyable talking to you.
you bet.
Thank you for joining us today. Please share this podcast and tell your friends about it. We can be found on a variety of platforms, including Spotify, YouTube, Podbean, and most other places where you get your podcasts. You can easily find us on any browser by simply typing in the KUBIK Report. You can reach me by email at vic@kubik.org. vic@kubik.org. Have a great day.